Ignite your curiosity with Austin Next. We're watching Austin transform from a thriving ecosystem into a global superstar. With our host, Jason Scharf, we aspire to better comprehend the true nature of innovation. Together, we will uncover what makes a successful ecosystem and navigate the technologies shaping our future. Now let's dive into what's next.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Austin Private Wealth, a registered investment advisor focused on fee-only financial planning and investment management. Their mission is to serve affluent clients with personalized financial advice, fostering a trusted relationship that will endure for generations to come. Austin Private Wealth is not just about managing wealth. They're about inspiring you to embrace a future filled with possibilities and helping you architect enduring legacies. Their core values of integrity, service, caring, excellence, and growth are at the heart of everything they do. Connect with them today at austinprivatewealth.com.
Austin Private Wealth is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Austin Private Wealth and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advice may be rendered by Austin Private Wealth unless a client service agreement is in place. Investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.
Today we're experimenting with a new episode format and embarking on our first digital road trip. We have three amazing guests who are going to take us on a journey through their regional ecosystems, and we'll learn about what's working, the challenges, and of course, what's next. Thank you all for being here today. I'd love to start off with each of you telling us a little about yourself and the region you're going to be talking about. So Jackie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this topic. My name is Jackie DiMonte. I'm with Chicago Ventures. We are an early stage, seed stage investor that focuses on companies being built in undercapitalized, overlooked markets and founders. This is a fun topic for me because those tend to be, geographies outside of the, traditional coastal markets.
Fred, why don't you're up next?
Yes, my name is Fred Grier. I'm the former tech reporter at the San Diego Business Journal. For the last 2 years, I've been covering the startup scene, venture capital, and covering some of the largest companies in San Diego. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about the San Diego ecosystem.
And last but definitely not least, Charlie.
Hi guys, thank you very much. My name is Charlie Lass. I am from London, where I've been sold a couple of businesses. I then moved to Boston to study at MIT, and I'm a senior lecturer on entrepreneurship and innovation at Sloan. Then I moved to Dallas and launched a venture firm called Dallas Inc. And we have a unique model, an incubator that takes an idea to market in 30 days.
Now that's fast. 30 days is amazingly quickly. Yeah, we're going to have to talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Let's talk about, these places in more depth. Charlie, why don't we start with you and talk about Dallas? What are the other sides of the Great Texas Triangle? What are we looking at in terms of growth there recently in the economic situation?
Safe to say it's exploded. You wouldn't notice in certain aspects, in certain places in the city, that there's been a pandemic. The amount of seed and mid-cap investment is higher than it's ever been. And we're seeing more entrepreneurs take a plunge from either jobs they didn't like, or that we've seen elsewhere, jobs that they wanted to use as a launch pad for something that they want to do on their own. That's kind of where we come in. There are 5 pillars that we're all pretty familiar with: entrepreneurship, academia, private wealth, companies, and government support. Dallas has got a huge amount of all of that. The weakest area is probably the entrepreneurs. That there aren't enough really experienced entrepreneurs who've gone through a full exit. And we're seeing now that people are realizing that chasing a unicorn isn't necessarily the right way to do it. We need consistent wins over and over and over and over to build the whole community. And that's what we're seeing.
Great. Jackie, I'm a Northwestern alum, so Chicago's always had a special place in my heart. Why don't you tell me what's going on in Chicagoland?
Yeah, well, Chicago is a interesting city from a startup perspective, just because it comes from such a diverse economy to begin with. So, what we've seen over the last 5 years, last 10 years, and then really accelerating now is just this sort of B2B landscape that builds up and takes advantage of the, sort of growth within the corporate ecosystem. It's a large city, third largest city in the US, large economy. And so we're really seeing folks breaking away from some of those larger corporates to start things out. I think similar to Charlie, we're early in the flywheel of consistent exits, large exits, staying independent. I think we've had a pretty good track record building with acquisitions, but those, sort of standalone independent companies are sort of few and far between right now. And so, really as we look forward, I think that emergence of seed capital is going to be a pretty big driver of, sort of those friends and family or initial rounds as we start to pull people out of the, sort of legacy ecosystem into entrepreneurship.
Fred, what's going on in San Diego?
Yes. So I think about 5 to almost a decade ago, if you were to ask that same question, the answer was, San Diego is a military town and it is, a emerging biotech town, and nothing happened there. It was very sleepy. But I think if you were to look today, you would say San Diego is no longer just a military and a biotech town. It is the 8th largest city in the U.S. and 1.4 million people currently live there, and it's growing rapidly. San Diego is home to a booming tech center, has a strong tourism scene, and much more. And it has been accelerated. And I would say that's because of, our universities, some of the top talent coming out of large companies that we have here. They're starting their own startups. San Diego is on the rise.
Fred, you started talking about the industries that are growing in San Diego. Can you be a little more specific? What's happening, what's growing, and what's shrinking?
Sure. So San Diego is mainly known for deep tech. We have some of the few large companies that many may know here. Qualcomm, which is a large semiconductor company. They employ 30,000 folks. They're a large, company. Another one is Illumina, which is made its name in the medical space. Dexcom, which is in the glucose monitoring space. ResMed, Viasat. We have these large deep tech companies here that are anchoring in the San Diego ecosystem. And now that we're seeing the maturity of these companies, some of these senior executives, other high-ranked folks are, they've been in this ecosystem and they saw opportunities to start new ideas. And we're seeing almost an acceleration of innovation and startups all across industries, not just deep tech. We're seeing it in biotech, we're seeing it in consumer tech, and also our research universities here have spun out many medical discoveries, and we're seeing drug development, and it has went across the board.
Jackie, you talked about how the diverse economy is in Chicago. What are the standouts of the Chicago economy?
From a tech perspective, certainly supply chain and logistics have had their moment. I think part of that is, you asked the question earlier about how has this changed a little bit recently or, throughout the pandemic. I think we've always had a pretty strong supply chain and logistics foundation. And then the issues that have come up across the last 2 years have just really pushed those companies to the forefront. Similar a little bit with digital health, although I'd say there are some other cities that, probably rival Chicago from a foundation from that perspective. Food and beverage continues to be, sort of a constant innovation there. There's a lot of CPG companies that are both highly acquisition oriented, but also, spin out a lot of really talented people. When we look at sort of the fintech, insurance, real estate side, maybe those have pulled back slightly given, what sort of challenges have happened over the last couple of years, but people are leaning really hard into, sort of this fintech innovation, new payment system. Certainly there's a grassroots crypto Web3 movement coming. A lot of, the trading firms have done some innovation and investing in this space there. So I'd say you're getting these pockets of people that are really pushing forward in, their unique industries.
Great. Charlie, Dallas was always known as a headquarters town. That's where people moved when they, whether it was American Airlines or Southwest Bell, now AT&T and the like. What's going on in Dallas today?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing more of that. Texas as a whole, but Dallas specifically, we've got Toyota, Hewlett-Packard, Tesla down in Austin. It is as though in the last few years, people have suddenly realized that it's cheap to be here. There's a huge amount of money and opportunities for both large companies and entrepreneurs is growing. Like it's a really favorable tax structure. And it's, the weather's nice.
Weather is good here, not compared to San Diego, maybe where we used to live, but Texas is a great place. Much warmer than Chicago, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, I was going to say this is the right time for the podcast to come out and pull the weather card.
There we go. Absolutely.
We're seeing the impacts of that spread across all stages of market capitalization. And it is increasing the amount of wealth within Dallas enormously. We don't see a range of competitive elements between Austin and Houston. Dallas sort of does its own thing and benefits from the Texas Triangle. I think Houston probably competes a bit with Dallas, but Dallas doesn't seem to really care.
Well, I won't tell anybody from Houston that. That's okay. Clearly, these last now 2 years, the pandemic has been in the news. It has been driving a lot of changes throughout the country and throughout the world. What do you guys see in your respective areas as happening with the response to the pandemic? Are more companies moving into the area, or are they moving out of the area? Are people moving out of the area because they can work remotely, or are they staying around? Fred, how about San Diego?
Yeah, so this is very interesting as a reporter. That was like one of my main tasks was, what's the activity happening? Are people leaving? Are they shutting down their business? Are people moving in? I think that last point, we saw that a lot. We saw large companies from other ecosystems like San Francisco, New York, and they came to San Diego because, it's not just about, being around an innovation hub, but they wanted the quality of living. They wanted great universities. They wanted, cheaper cost of living. And so we saw one big company called ClickUp, which is, kind of a Asana or a productivity management platform. They're very huge. They came to San Diego and they have made their main headquarters here. They raised $400 million and they're a unicorn company. And they made the transition during 2020. And we saw many of that, over the last year or so, and it's going to continue. But with COVID, I would say for San Diego, the silver lining here was the biotech community because of COVID-19. We saw a number of companies not only, raise large rounds, but they were able to grow their company, their headcount, and, really capitalize over the last year or so because of the COVID-19 vaccine, from grants to just finding success and rallying and participating in a global pandemic and contributing through its innovation.
Fred, I'm curious kind of where the migration is coming from. You said a little bit from New York and the Bay Area. Let's take the ClickUp example. Where were they moving from?
They were moving from the Bay Area. So San Francisco, I think, saw the major exodus. They went to Austin, they went to Miami, and San Diego was one of the cities that a lot of San Francisco Bay Area founders have moved to, and that was because of quality of living.
Yeah, we saw lots of companies moving into the San Diego area in 2020. I mean, Apple with their 1,500 person campus and Facebook and others. So clearly, San Diego's been a beneficiary of all that happening. Charlie, what about you? What's going on with the pandemic as far as you see in Dallas?
I think that a lot of companies, and you just mentioned Apple, I mean, they've got a 20,000 person campus opening in North Austin, I think, this year. If you're going to open a second office, being in North Texas makes a lot of sense. It's 4 hours from everywhere, and you can spread the risk of remote working. You don't have to have people traveling into one location. So if you are damaged by another outbreak, it's not going to take down your whole staff. I think that's what we're seeing. It's an affordable way to kind of test satellite office expansion, and we're seeing a lot of it.
How about Chicago, Jackie?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the pandemic has shifted how we think about geography. I mean, geography used to be such a big filter. I mean, 3 to 5 years ago, you couldn't get seed capital from the coast. It was hard to raise an A. There was just not this sort of liquidity in the marketplace. We started to see some of that, shift pre-pandemic, and then COVID hit, and it was like where you lived, where you invested, where you worked. It just didn't matter. And so I think it's actually even finer of a point now coming back to geography. It's sort of like this big arc that we've had. Chicago used to be sort of local seed capital. Companies would grow up, then you'd go to the coasts. There would be a local HQ, and then the next office would be San Francisco. Talent, it would either be homegrown, kind of pulling from the Big Ten university, sort of like those Midwest universities, or, people that left to go to the Bay Area had kids, came back to, have a more affordable life. And then with COVID, it's kind of like no one really needs to be anywhere. We saw a lot of our companies, our local startups, in the winter, people would leave for warmer places last year, and I think ended up staying for a while. Like we kind of blew everything up, and then some point in time, maybe it was summer when it got hot in Texas or Miami or, wherever else people went, or you just realized you needed a little bit more of a density. We saw people kind of like come back in to Chicago. So it was a little bit of like a massive boomerang, I think, for the city specifically. I think we're still seeing, sales offices in particular. I think, it was mentioned earlier, sort of like the second HQ or satellite. We're seeing a lot of that coming through both the big companies, and then once the startup raises kind of a Series C or growth round, they're opening up sales offices. Dallas and Chicago are very similar, from like central of the country. Great local talent. You can get anywhere, and so we're just seeing a little bit more of the return to normal, but still the advantages of people are willing to invest or hire, outside of where HQ might be.
I've got a comment to follow up on that.
Oh, go ahead.
On the geography piece, and our fund is called Dallas Inc. We actually operate the same model under a completely different name, which is international and kind of under the radar. But as soon as we added Dallas into the name, everyone went nuts. They thought this was a local firm who's investing in seed capital, and we became a deal very, very quickly. We only launched this back in May. We're now launching Austin Inc., Houston Inc., Fort Worth Inc. for exactly the same reason, because people want to feel like, and we benefit from, want to feel like an investment firm and an entrepreneurial ecosystem actually is local. The challenge is linking private wealth to local entrepreneurs, because certainly in Dallas, there's this disconnect where people aren't entirely convinced that there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are succeeding. Whereas actually you look at the list of some of these massive companies who've started in Dallas that they don't really talk about. We don't like to, Dallas likes to talk about itself quite a lot, but people don't like to shout about successes. And it's a weird dynamic that we've seen change over the past 3 years. And I think that's going to be something that has a really big impact on Dallas, where it starts to believe in itself a bit more.
Yeah, culturally, Chicago has a very similar feel as to what you're describing. And I do think there is, there is inherently that benefit to both hometown pride, but also that local network. I mean, we can hire anywhere, but if you want to hire, the best CRO, you want to have some sort of like track record with that person. And I think, we're the same, like we're Chicago Ventures, and, we don't only invest in Chicago. Austin is our second largest market, but there is some of that like density of, network pride, and then, getting some of that feedback loop going.
It's been interesting, and Jackie, to your point earlier about kind of the leaving and then the coming back into the regions. And we kind of realized, I think, in 2020 that you can work from anywhere. But what's ended up happening is you're still having, I think, this agglomeration effect and people wanting to be just the cities that were the it places the last 10 years. That's has been more what's been thrown up in the air, and we're having different types of things. And it's interesting because you have the components of people who are in the ecosystem, but then doing different things remotely, right? So, I think I'm a perfect example. Like, I'm deep into the Austin ecosystem, but my actual day job I work remotely for a company based in Maryland. So it kind of has interesting, where do you want to be and spend that physical energy versus the work that you do, and on-sites become more important, and that kind of dynamic. So I think that's an interesting dynamic going forward. And we kind of keep having these new locations, at least from the last 10 years, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because we used to talk about investors wanted to be within an hour's drive. And then when the pandemic hit, it was, they wanted to be within a couple of time zones. Now it sounds like almost either we're moving back to that localism, or we're seeing a splintering of possibilities amongst a wide variety of other cities. Now, Fred, in San Diego, that's always been a fairly good size venture market. Never as big as it wanted to be, but a decent size. How is that changing now? How are people changing in terms of the ability to get investors out of the San Diego market?
Definitely. So I would say, over the last 3 years, there was a sentiment among early stage founders, maybe first time founders saying, oh, you're in San Diego. Like typically it was really hard to raise, a Series A or let alone even a pre-seed. A lot of the investments that were made into early stage startups in the last 3 years were outside of San Diego. There really wasn't internal investors living in San Diego investing in locally. And I think we've seen that change. Maybe it's the migration from, the Bay Area or New York, and they're moving to San Diego, and now they're putting their dollars into those startups. But I think also remote work, we see remote investing, and other investors are investing in other regions beyond their main location. And I think we're also seeing a growth in investor groups. They would, be around, let's say a fund manager would set up shop here in San Diego, and they would last 5 years, and they would shut down the shop. But I think now we're seeing more groups and new investors come in San Diego and continue to put dollars into local startups. There's a handful I could name, but one of the largest angel groups here in San Diego is Tech Coast Angels, San Diego's chapter. They're the largest chapter among Tech Coast Angels. They invested 25 deals last year, roughly 13 million. And I think we're going to continue to see other funds and investors continue to put their money in San Diego startups as we have more unicorns here and a lot more companies that are being spun up in the last 3 to 5 years.
Well, Fred, and it's interesting to see that San Diego is starting to expand the power outside of San Diego. I mean, you mentioned Tech Coast Angels, and I am a member of the group, and stayed a member after we left as well, and seeing that kind of evolution. What's an interesting thing that was one of the impetus actually behind us wanting to do this episode, and Fred, I want to start with you, but then I want to hear Jackie's thoughts as well, is that when we were looking at the, outside of the big ecosystems that everybody names, right? The Bay Area, New York, Boston, LA, when you look at it from a numbers perspective. And then you kind of saw over the last couple of years, right? Like Austin is always in the zeitgeist, always in the national media. Miami, amazingly through one tweet, really became part of that conversation as well. But what is really interesting to me is when you actually go and look at at least the static statistics, a volume of, VC funding, amount of companies, Fortune 500, whatever kind of metric that you want to use, San Diego and also Chicago significantly are larger than Austin, but don't get nearly the coverage or in the conversation that they do. And one something I know, some common acquaintances, Fred, of you and I, went out, and I think maybe you were part of the one who made the report as well, not being covered by PitchBook or CB Insight, and said, fine, we'll do our own, tech report. Even though, as far as my reading goes, San Diego, in terms of VC funding, is the 5th largest in the country. So what do you think is, for San Diego, what are the barriers? What is it that is causing, really from a narrative perspective, to not be getting out there beyond kind of the local region?
Sure. I think you bring up some great points. I have my opinion here. I mean, I'm a reporter, so I work for the media, and I would say that, a few numbers out. So it goes San Francisco, New York, San Jose, Boston, LA, then San Diego. And then, last year, actually 2020, San Diego raised $5.2 billion in venture capital. And the last 3 years, that number is around $2 billion, $3 billion. And last year, 2021, San Diego raised roughly $8 billion, up from $5 billion last year. And like you said, it hasn't been talked about in the same light as Miami, San Francisco, and these other ecosystems. And I think it's because, the investors that are investing in these companies in those ecosystems, they have great relationships with the media. As those funding rounds get raised, they go to Fortune, they go to the Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal. And I think in San Diego, we pride ourselves in just doing the work. And I think maybe we're not the best marketers for our city. And I think the mayor of Miami is a great example. He is shining light on, the great innovation on the storytelling. He's investing in that. And I think their marketing budgets are a lot larger in those ecosystems. And I think looking ahead, hopefully our other ecosystems will start telling their story a little bit more.
No, it'd be interesting to see. And Jackie, kind of the same question to you is, in our kind of offline discussion was, you weren't surprised on where Chicago ranked when you saw it locally, but then, was completely under the radar when I could first see it and said, oh, wow, it's significantly larger than I would have expected.
Yeah, it's interesting because the numbers that Fred threw out are pretty much in line with Chicago as well. I think last year it was something around 8 billion raised, up from 2 to 3 the years before. So there was sort of this explosion, and it's always, I don't want to say it punches above its weight in terms of like the city and the makeup, but it certainly punches above its weight from a attention perspective. And I think part of that is just the cities are different. Austin is keep Austin weird. Miami is Miami. Like everyone has the logos of, like the 90s print when it comes to Miami. And then you look at a place like Chicago where it's, the Windy City or the city of broad shoulders. There's just a different culture around, how you build companies, how you talk about them. I mean, even the local ecosystems. I mean, Fred talked about the mayor of Miami. I mean, we have these great support systems from our, sort of public groups, but they're a lot about, doing things like they're, P33 launched, and they're set up like specifically to connect growth stage startups and, enterprises that are local to, increase the customer throughput. It's like, things like that, where it's like, you're not going to shout that out and people aren't like, whoa, like we signed another, B2B SaaS customer. Like that's not like sexy. It just is moving business forward. And I think that's part of the messaging, disconnect there. I think, when people think of Chicago, they just think of different cities than, Austin, Miami, some of these. I mean, even San Diego, I think probably has a nicer brand given the weather disconnect. But, I think that's part of it. It's just a branding or a narrative kind of spinning out.
Charlie, there's an interesting dynamic that I think maybe California cities are the only other one that kind of has this compared with Texas, where when you have significant multi-city ecosystems, right? Like, not to overspeed, Illinois, I'm assuming it's mostly Chicago where like the ecosystems is, versus you have both the internal competition of the Texas Triangle, but then how do you get, and that's also, by the way, one of my theories on San Diego's underappreciation. The narrative is you have LA and you have Silicon Valley within the same. So it's kind of like, oh, do I want to talk about another California city? How do you see that dynamic of like, hey, here's the growth that's going on in Texas, and we've got 4 different cities that are all doing well in terms of ecosystems, and did you end up getting kind of some of that muddled? And like, and I sometimes I think that, maybe even San Antonio kind of gets the short end there of being like, okay, it's the 4th city that's going to be talked about in this case, right?
It's a really interesting point. And you talked earlier about when you really look into the data, it's sometimes quite different to what people assume to be the case. And the amount of unicorns and venture funding last year in Dallas, people wouldn't know about these companies, but they're raising, I was just, before this was looking, we've got the biggest, $1.2 billion for Integrity Marketing Group, raised $1.2 billion from Silver Lake. Caris Life Sciences, 830 million, Mavenir, 500 million, the LTK, 300 million. Like there's multiple unicorns that are just hanging out, but it's not Dallas proper. It's Irving, it's Fort Worth, it's Richardson. And that, to your point, like the DFW metro area has an amazing amount of success within different areas. I mean, Fort Worth has more patents filed and approved than Dallas. And it's half the size. You've got to think, well, what is supporting that? How is that working? But when you think about, am I going to invest in Texas? Like below San comes Fort Worth, unless it's military, biotech, or engineering. The startup scene in Fort Worth struggles because it's next. Got this big sister next door. But there's a big gap between early stage C. I mean, you can raise early stage money in Dallas pretty easily, but raise A is really hard, but then raising Series C is really easy. And I don't know why.
I got a question then based on, as we're seeing, we talk about some unicorns and some of these raising Cs. What are we seeing I want to stick with you for a minute, Charlie, in terms of that life cycle? Are we seeing, these companies raising, becoming unicorns, going IPO, they're getting bought out at the Series B stage? If they are getting acquired, are they staying, or is it really, something that's being, bought and then great, the money stays and they got to do it again, but the actual company leaves. What is kind of happening in the kind of innovation life cycle?
Just a massive simplification, but I think that they're staying. There's an enormous company called ISN, and the founder of which is a friend of mine, and they're worth $4.5 billion, and they've got a massive office on McKinney Avenue, and no one's ever heard of them. Over the last 25 years, it's quietly growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they've got offices all over the world, but they're headquartered here, and they started here. So they're not trying to exit. They're not trying necessarily to sell it. I mean, of course, everyone would like that, but they seem to be comfortable in just printing cash. These companies have reached a certain point, raising the investment. Some of these guys have got 10, 15,000 staff, but they're not very well known.
Interesting. Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of start with the earliest stages, which is it used to be pretty tough to raise a seed round, even a pre-seed round. Getting angel syndicates together was kind of a pain in the butt. No one was leading. It was just, you could be raising forever. And we're starting to see more professionalized micro funds, angel groups, really supporting those early, friends and family pre-seed rounds, things like that. There are a few that have popped up. Even recently, Long Jump, Fifth Star, especially some on, seeking for like DE&I across the city, because we do have not just an economically diversity, but a demographically diverse one. So we're seeing stronger sources of capital. I would say similar to how Dallas was described. It's not super easy to raise that first round. I mean, even groups like our Chicago Ventures, there's a sort of a cohort of a handful of seed and A firms locally. It's still not enough for like a liquid market, and so I think that early stage is still fairly difficult, even though it can certainly be done and be done over and over and over again with local investors. That middle layer of growth capital is typically coming from outside the city. And then I think the biggest change that I'm seeing from an exit perspective is we've traditionally had pretty strong acquisitions, and they keep coming, $250 to $2 billion, fairly consistently. I think that the companies that are part of this, sort of next to exit cohort are just getting too big for some of those acquisitions. I mean, we had, I think a dozen unicorns, I don't know, they call them minted, or, 12 companies in Chicago reached unicorn status. And obviously that's not the be all end all, but you can start to see some of the ambitions grow beyond, hey, let's just go for a really good acquisition, and more like, hey, we want to build these, sort of legacy brands. So I think that's going to be the biggest change, is at the very earliest stages and at the very latest stages, over the next couple of years.
Fred, historically, I know one of the big issues in San Diego, specifically in life science, was the, build to flip, right? You had these virtual biotech companies, 20 people, you get the asset to, point A, B, or C, and you didn't, not a lot of kind of huge growth kind of came out of that. And I knew that was kind of one of the big challenges, especially in, I think, the early 2000s. Where do you see, San Diego today? I mean, you said like it's changed in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of the life cycle of the companies.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for pointing that out. So I would say the last year we saw an explosion of public companies. Like as you mentioned, a lot of companies last 2 or 3 years ago, their objective was to exit in the next, 5-year horizon or 10-year horizon. And now we're seeing companies want to go to the public markets. And I think we're seeing, a few different trends, but I think last year we saw a trend of SPACs, and biotech companies were kind of the hot companies for that. And so we saw a number of that, probably around roughly 20 companies go public, mainly biotech companies. And I think that we also saw a lot of consolidation from large companies. We had over 195 acquisitions, and some of the largest ones were multi-billions. We had Arena Pharma got acquired for $7 billion last year, BioLegend for $5 billion, and a number of others in the multi-billion-dollar range. And so I think it's across the board. We're seeing companies get acquired, but we're also seeing companies want to go public. And not just biotech. We also have some major tech companies that went public. 2 of them were in the EV space, self-driving trucks, Too Simple. And then another one called Nuve, N-U-V-E-E. They went public via SPAC. So I think as I talk to founders and interviewing them, I ask them, what's their end goal? Are you trying to exit? Are you trying to sell for a multi-billion or multi-million, exit number? Or are you trying to go public? And this last year, all the unicorn companies, including ClickUp, their answer has, I want to go public.
So we always kind of end the podcast the same way, but given the geographic diversity, I'm going to have to ask it differently. So for each of you, what's the big trend in your city? What's the big challenge in your city? And most importantly, what's next? Charlie, how about Dallas? What's the big trend, the big challenge, and what's next for Dallas?
Thank you for giving me so much time to prepare. Okay. Big, what do you got? Challenge, trends, and what?
And what's next?
Stalling for time here. Lovely. Right. The biggest challenge is that despite there being an enormous amount of private wealth in a very, very small geographic area, we call it the chalice of Dallas, where the two interstates meet, Highland Park, University Park, incredibly wealthy areas. We're seeing more traditional investment. When you're collecting mailbox money from an oil field, why would you invest in a risky tech startup? That's a really big challenge to break. There's a lot of private wealth that isn't being allocated locally. Biggest opportunity is, I suppose, to try and break that. That's what we're focused on. Where our fund is essentially part of it is a mutual fund for startups, and we own 100% of the concepts in Fund One, which means we can sell them for $5 or $5 million or $500 million. It allows us to allocate funds much more easily. So what's next is, I think we're going to see a sort of shakedown of the old guard. There's a group of people who've been here for 10 years and kind of want things to stay the same, but there's a huge amount of influx of foreigners like me and people from the coast who have realized what an opportunity Dallas and Texas in general presents, and seeing that have an impact on the way in which we invest and launch and buy potentially from local companies. Branding something as a Dallas business, whether it be a consumer product that could be operating nationally, I think we're going to see more and more of that in the same way that we had with Austin, 5-10 years ago.
Great. Jackie, how about Chicago?
Yeah, I'm glad Charlie went first, so I had a little bit of time to think about that. I am excited for where Chicago is going. Historically, we've had some maybe it's less ambitious, more cautious. Sort of this like, hey, we want to be startups, but like, we're not really, running hard at the concrete wall and just ready to, blow it up or break through it. I think that is changing. I think we are getting more ambitious. We're, having new funds raised, new people running those funds, new companies, more interesting business models. Like there's just sort of a froth that is forming that wasn't there before. I think the hard part is a little bit of this. It's good and bad. The rising tide lifts all boats. Every city has had a completely knockout year, and Chicago's no different. I mean, we've kind of kept going back to this across the podcast. It's just, there's more money being raised, more companies growing bigger, and really the ratio across cities hasn't really changed. I think the only city that really gained market share from a venture perspective was New York. A few lost a little, and then everyone was kind of like, punching at their weight, but the whole market exploded. And I think that's where the challenge is for Chicago is we are so excited about everything that is going on, but have sort of not contextualized that it's going on everywhere as well. And we need to push even harder to carve out, to make that name for ourselves. Going back to one of those earlier questions on like, why are we not in the headlines like everyone else? I think, what comes next for that, there's this really interesting concept of startup ecosystem flywheels. Charlie mentioned, sort of the pillars of it earlier. It might have been Bill Gurley who, said like what he counts the flywheel is, 3 or more independent, maybe $10 billion, $5 billion companies in the city. I think we have a chance of getting there, in this current cohort of late stage growth stage companies. And if that is the case, I think we start to see those flywheels really, really moving. So I'm hopeful that's, sort of the next stage is like, hey, we have these companies that are training grounds for our next round of entrepreneurs. We have these angel investors who are also, executives at really powerful brands and have learned a lot and can share a lot. I think, that we're like right at the cusp of it. We're at those companies that are valued between, 1 and 5 billion. We need a few to like cross over and just blow the city out and command the respect that you would give to, any of the other Fortune 500s. We want to have that in the tech sector.
Can I just challenge a point? I think the market has exploded in general, and I'm a little defensive, but I think Dallas investment, the venture capital amount has actually changed in the past 18 months within Dallas. And admittedly, this article was written by the Dallas Business Journal, so they might be a little bit biased, but like the growth in investment from external funds in Dallas-based companies is significantly up from 2020. I don't have the other stats, but I'd like to think that Dallas is actually growing faster than other places.
Well, I think so. I'm not. So I would argue with that last sentence, not the former. I think that we saw geographic barriers break down. So I have no doubt that there's more capital going into Dallas. It's coming from different sources. There are probably also people who have started investing in the asset class that never had before, just because of the economic environment that we're in. I haven't done the research down to this city level. I think I might have looked at it on a state by state or a regional level. So, there are definitely nuances the smaller or the more local you get. But I do think every sort of like second tier ecosystem is starting to see this like momentum build. And it's just, can you really tip it over? When the tide goes out, will we have that robust infrastructure there such that we've already crossed over? It's fine if the fair weather friends, the, angel investors who are just throwing some money because they sold, their real estate at, their house for 4 times what they bought it for. Like when those people go, is that infrastructure. And that's where like, I haven't seen the like dramatic, we've all raised, I think Chicago raised like 3 times as much last year as they did the year before that. But that doesn't mean we like really broke out in a way that was unique compared to other places. And we're dealing with such large numbers here. So like, there are definitely small changes, but I'm actually not convinced that any city like won 2021.
Okay.
I know I went on a little bit of a soapbox there, but I think it is fascinating. This whole geography was so important, it became not important at all. And now it's like, we're kind of coming back to our roots. Like it does matter. It's just interesting.
I think it'd be really interesting to see, as you say, what happens when the tide goes out.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you sell your S&P 500 stock and you invest in a startup, okay, cool. But when that's not possible, what happens?
Yep.
Well, Fred, you're the only one on the coast with a tide, so you get to finish it up. What's next, San Diego?
What's next is, I would say, we just need to continue to collaborate. I will give credit to an organization called Connect San Diego, who has been the primary driver of bringing investors and saying, hey, look at San Diego. There's a guy named Mike Corinne who put a billboard up in San Francisco 5 years ago saying, hey, San Diego's better. Engineers, you should come to San Diego. And, since then, we've seen the numbers of interest and venture dollars continue to increase. And I think other folks like Neil Bloom at Fresh Brew Tech, and we've seen more venture partners, they've hosted events and brought people to look at San Diego, and it's continue doing that. I think San Diego thrives off collaboration. I think that's the biggest opportunity for us. And I think one of the biggest challenges is something that you guys pointed out was Apple, Amazon, Google are all expanding here. They want the talent that San Diego is breeding. And so that means startups are going to have, higher competition to compete for that talent. And I think that's going to be a challenge going forward. And I think one thing I'm most excited about is the fintech scene. I think the fintech sector is going to continue to boom. And one area of interest is cryptocurrency. A little known fact, there's a cryptocurrency startup that was started in San Diego called Solana. Solana created a crypto coin, and it has since, the guy who created it was an ex-Qualcomm founder. And he had the idea, him and his co-founder started in Solana Beach. That's how they got the name of Solana. And has since then has raised money from Andreessen Horowitz and other blue chip investors. And they have moved to San Francisco. So I think the cryptocurrency space are going to continue to thrive in San Diego. But I think the biggest opportunity and challenge is how do we keep innovation here in our city and continue to collaborate.
Jackie, Charlie, Fred, thank you so much. In the last hour, we've been able to travel all over the country and get this road trip started and learn more about what all these other innovation powerhouses really are looking at. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.